Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Very nice to see you all here. We're very pleased to have a forum today to discuss this new book by Brooke Taylor and Sam Korsmo, which you've seen, which you can see up here. Vietnam Asia's Rising Star. So we're very pleased to first hear a little bit about the main themes of this book by the authors, and then we can have a bit of a discussion, open the floor for questions and so forth. It's a very interesting topic for us at FSPPM, as we have for many years been thinking about this question of what are the obstacles for Vietnam's rapid economic growth to achieve the levels of development that were achieved in the Northeast Asian economies? And also, what are the opportunities available in a changing global environment? This is not the era that the Taiwanese faced in the 1960s or the Koreans faced in the 1970s. It's a very different world. So thinking about the opportunities for exports, for development, for investment, for infrastructure, for finance in this new world, given these rapid changes in global geopolitics, is a very interesting question and one that we hope to delve into today. I'm very pleased to see that it is a rising star as opposed to a rising tiger. We've had a lot of tigers and dragons. I think the first, I'm sure there are many in Vietnamese literature, but in the Western literature, we can go back to Norman Lewis, who wrote a very important book called A Dragon Apparent about Vietnam in 1951. And I urge you, if you are interested in this theme of how Vietnam will situate itself within this panoply of various economies, societies, cultures in East and Southeast Asia, that's a good place to start. And we also had Ray Mallon and Brian Van Arcady right after the East Asian financial crisis, who wrote a book called Vietnam, A Transition Tiger, which was a very important book at that period when Southeast Asia seemed to be losing steam after the East Asian financial crisis. And the question was, would Vietnam as a transition economy be able to break through where the other Southeast Asian economies had failed? So I see this book very much in that tradition, looking at what are the unique characteristics of Vietnam relative to the East Asian rapidly developing economies and also the other Southeast Asian economies. I think what's really interesting about this book partly is the very long experience of both of the authors in Vietnam, and what they bring to the narrative is a lot of personal experience, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of insights based on interactions with Vietnamese people over many years and with government and with business over many years. So I think that very much that on-the-ground approach is very welcome, and I think brings us some very important insights into Vietnam's situation at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our authors, who will first make a brief presentation about the main contents, the main themes of the book, and then after that we will have a panel discussion and open the floor for questions. So over to you, Brooke.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think maybe I'll just give a quick introduction of myself. I'll let Sam introduce himself, and then we'll dive into the presentation. So yeah, thank you. My name is Brooke Taylor. I'm currently the CEO of Asset Management at Vina Capital. But I came to Vietnam back in 1997 is when I moved. Actually, my first visit to Vietnam was in 1995. I was working for a now infamous accounting firm called Arthur Andersen. I started my career in New Zealand. I came here in 95 to teach the first group of graduates that Arthur Andersen employed in those days. And I was so impressed by what I had experienced in that visit, the willingness of people to learn. And in fact, the results as a result of that training were quite outstanding for a group of young students that had really never done accounting, auditing, or even been taught in English before. So it was a really wonderful experience, and it always motivated me to come back and back. And then, as I said, I joined in '97. I continued my career in accounting till 2007 when I joined Vena Capital. So I've been with Vena Capital now for 17 years. I did my at INSEAD in 2014, a great experience, and it really helped me, like you all who are studying, build my intellect and experience, and help me fashion this book as well. Sam?
Okay, thanks, Brooke. My name is Sam Korsmo. I'm from the United States, and I have a pretty long history with Vietnam. I've been in Vietnam in and out from 1990 until now. So maybe I have more experience than many of you in this room, given what I'm seeing on your faces. But in 1990, I first came here as a student, as a tourist, and then a student. I studied Vietnamese at the University of Hanoi for about 8 months. And then that was in preparation to get to a graduate program. And I went to graduate school at the University of Washington. And I got a master's in international studies with a focus on Vietnam. My master's thesis was on Dai Mai, and I studied more Vietnamese there. And after that, I came back to Vietnam in 1993, and I was here until 2004. About half the time I was a business journalist, and the other half I had my own research company. And then I wrote my first book in 03, 04 or so. And that was a book called Saigon Stories, which is a collection of oral histories of 5 Vietnamese families. Then I left Vietnam, but I came back in 2018, and I have been here ever since. And for the last 4 years or so, full-time as a writer. I did work on this with Brooke, and I'm working on 2 more books right now. And so I guess one of Harry's questions is the differences you've seen. So I've seen Vietnam from 1990 all the way until today. So you can imagine the changes that I've been able to witness, and many of which I've been able to write about. And I feel very honored to do that. And I look forward to sharing some ideas with you and hearing your questions.
Right. I think we're going to have to try hard to get through this presentation quite quickly. We have a lot of slides, so I think we'll move quite through it speedily. But that's right. Before we do turn the page, though, I will, since Jonathan mentioned it, refer to the name, Asia's Rising Star. It's a play on words, obviously. We dealt with some designers, and they came up with this cover, and it's obviously a play on the flag. I think it suits beautifully the pitch that we're making. An interesting story was we had several designs for the international market, and we said, we'll do this one, because if you put it on a bookshelf, it's very, very visible and it will stand out and mean something. But when we came to talk to our publisher in Vietnam, they said, no, you can't do this. It looks like a government document. So we had to go to the second one, which Sam and I both liked, which was this one. Our international publisher said, no, you can't use this one because it looks too Stalinist. It's too we don't want Vietnam to be looked at like that. But it's popular, and I love this image for obvious reasons, right? Some people have said to us, where's that statue? So hopefully one day they will build one just like that. And then I think that would be a masterpiece, right? So let's go on. So that's us. I want to start by, why did we want to write this book? Okay, so firstly, for our own better understanding, Sam and I have built our careers in Vietnam. We've seen and experienced significant changing in the country over those years, and we wanted to understand whether or not it was going to continue. Many people know this statistic, right? The GDP rate has changed. When I came to Vietnam, the GDP per capita was about $230, right? And now it's over $4,400. Everybody knows that statistic, but perhaps one of the more exciting and more important things is the poverty rate, right? When I came to Vietnam, the poverty rate was over 53%. Now, depending on which statistic you look at, it's about 3%. And I would say that there's no other country in the world that has achieved that dramatic change in the reduction in poverty and enhancing people's lives than than what Vietnam has achieved over the last 20 years. It's really phenomenal to see that degree of change. And also, one of the other things that sort of I became aware of was some international reports that projected that Vietnam would be a large economy one day. This diagram at the bottom of this page is from a PwC report in 2017, which says that Vietnam will be the 20th largest economy in the world by 2050. That got me questioning, how is that possible? Can Vietnam really be a G20 country? The G20 is a very exclusive group of economies in the world. And to think that a country like Vietnam can go from the level of poverty that it had to a G20 country in about 50 years is really an outstanding result. Can it really be achieved? And I think well, we'll see later, but we think it can. But the reality is, PwC, if you project the numbers forward, the number could be as high as 14th largest economy in the world, right? So it depends how you assumptions and so on, but that's a very exciting future. Can we get there? So that was for Sam and I. But then we also said, look, we meet a lot of international people that come to Vietnam, and they turn up with a whole lot of, well, perceptions, in fact, misconceptions about the country, right? And we felt that there was a need to correct those misconceptions. The number of people in the United States that still think the war is relevant to Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War, or the role of communism as a one-party state, or whether there are free market, whether there's a free market economy. All of these things, these misconceptions that exist about Vietnam are historic. They were true once, but there's a desperate need for someone to communicate and tell the rest of the world to define what contemporary Vietnam is today, because the country has changed so much. It's very difficult for the brand Vietnam to internationally to follow that. So we felt that there was a need to do that. And then the third group, which is the last one, and ultimately the most important, we realized when we were writing the book that most people in Vietnam do not understand what's going on here, right? And many people think that the dramatic changes that they see in Vietnam are also being reflected in other countries around the world as well. It's not true. Many, many other countries around the world, their growth has stalled. They run the risk of actually declining economies. And what's happening in Vietnam is actually quite unique. There might be one or two other countries in the world, but it's very special. And we wanted Vietnamese to appreciate that and actually start to celebrate it, right? Vietnamese aren't celebrating enough the changes and successes that have been achieved over the last 20 years. When I came to Vietnam, there was nothing to be proud about. People were very, very, there's nothing they could say, we do this well, we do this well, we do this now. Now, there are many things you can celebrate. And I think that this will continue to grow and people should start to celebrate. It's not just the football team beating Thailand. What about the football team going to the World Cup one day? Those sorts of things we want to celebrate in the future. So anyway, you need to appreciate what's happening in your country so you can plan your own futures better as well, right? So these are the reasons we wanted to write this book. So this is the hypothesis. Vietnam is the next tiger economy of Asia. It will grow and develop in a way that's similar to South Korea and Taiwan as they grew as tiger economies. Sorry? So there's two questions here. What is Vietnam a tiger economy? In particular, what is a tiger economy? And two, will it grow to be in a similar way that South Korea and Taiwan did when those countries were going through their tiger economy phases? I think there's another question buried in this, which will sort of come out in our presentations. Why did we compare Vietnam with South Korea and Taiwan and not with other countries in Southeast Asia, right? And we'll make sure we cover that later on. But I think it's a really important observation. So this is the approach we took. We looked at the past. When I travel the world a lot, and one thing I've learned is one of the best ways to understand a country is to understand its history. You have to understand its history to understand how people feel, what the culture is, what's molded that country and molded its economy and the way that it operates and the way that people operate. We wanted to look at the present. What is a tiger economy? What advantages does Vietnam have over other countries? And then we wanted to, which included looking at some case studies, 6 case studies. And then we wanted to look at what would the future look like based upon what we've seen from the past, what the drivers of growth are today, what can we expect in the future? So that's roughly how it's set out. So we started by looking, what is a tiger economy? And this is the Google search, right? This is, maybe someone wants to write a paper on this and then we can refer to it, but we could not find any authoritative reference to what is a tiger economy. Jonathan, there is one maybe, we should have consulted you. But anyway, we had to come up, that this is the Google definition, and it's quite easy to understand, but it's pretty difficult to benchmark Vietnam against that by itself. So at the moment, the tiger economy is Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. So what we did is we came up with some metrics. Now, we aren't economists, right? We're not experts in anything. Sam's an expert writer, and I'm an expert accountant, auditor. We're not economists, we're not sociologists, geopoliticists, anything like that. But so a lot of what we do is very anecdotal. It's based on our own observations, and it's based upon models that we came up with ourselves. So we came up with this tiger economy metrics, the numbers. Does it show significant rates of growth over an extended period of time? Is the economy built on exports, or more importantly, trade, right? Is it engaging with other countries through trade or services or transfer of technologies? Industrialization. Is the country going through an accelerated period of industrialization? Not just the move from agricultural to manufacturing to services, but this thing about trade as well, the adoption of new technologies, an accelerated period of growth that we often see in countries as they're growing and accelerate through the middle income levels of GDP. Do they have the expertise, both public and private, in business? And are they engaging with international markets? And do they have the leadership in place to manage the economy, set the right policy, establish the right laws, and so forth? So these were the metrics. And our conclusions were in the numbers, yes. Exports, yes. Industrialization, soft, no. It's not completely evident that this is happening at the moment. But to be honest, some of these things change. Even we published the book 18 months ago, and I think if we rated these things again, we might actually rate them higher than what we have. Expertise, soft, yes. Markets, hard, yes. It is very engaged in trade. And leadership, we said inconclusive. But this one might have changed in the last 3 months. It would be a soft yes. Yeah. And that's very exciting. Maybe we'll talk about that later on. So then we compared it with South Korea and Taiwan during the 1980s and 90s. It's not a perfect comparison, right? There's no doubt we can't just reset it. But we're not comparing Vietnam with other countries today, right? That's perhaps the most important thing. We're saying, hey, they are tiger economies. They grew, the rich countries now. Can we do the same, right? We looked at history, culture. Sorry, the reasons we chose those 2 countries, which was really getting to, was a range of factors, right? The history, the culture, and the politics. And I must say, I mean, they're all interrelated in many ways, right? The culture is a product of history. There's no doubt about that. And if we look at politics, we can look at what South Korea and Taiwan and China and even Japan were like 30 or 40 years ago. Their political structures, well, they were not multi-party systems, right? So anyway, they're all related. The one that is always very passionate to me is this. And when I talk, and it's one of the reasons that sort of was the foundations of this thinking and some of what we were putting in the book. When I meet with international investors, one thing I say to them to try and spark them, say, you don't know Vietnam as well as you think you do. And one thing that I can tell you that will change the way you think about the country is to think about the culture, okay? Because I think when we look at countries, we have a habit of grouping them geographically or just by common groupings. So in Vietnam's case, there's no doubt it's in Southeast Asia, so we can compare it with Southeast Asian countries. But actually, if you're looking at growing an economy and the future of a country, maybe culture is more powerful than geography, right? And if you then go back to history and look at culture and look at history, you will realize that Vietnam is very much Northeast Asian rather than Southeast Asian. And that's why we get back to this comparison with South Korea, Taiwan, and we could even make comparisons with Japan and parts of China as well. They're all Northeast Asian culture, colloquially referred by some to the chopstick nations, but it's a little bit crude. But that's really important. Now, when I tell investors that, it's a much easier sell to say, so you're not investing in Thailand, the Philippines, or Indonesia. You're investing in South Korea in 1990. You're investing in Taiwan in 1980, right? Would you make that investment today knowing what happened in those countries in the last 30 or 40 years, right? So that's the nexus of it. And I think it's a very powerful message, certainly with a lot of the people that I meet to talk about Vietnam. So what we did is we looked at the drivers, what we identified as drivers that South Korea and Taiwan had when they were building their economies. And these are them: priority to education, high-tech investment, post-war growth. A really good list of things that really help to drive is still growing, and why is it growing? And it's these sorts of things, right? It's just things that just make or support the country's growth no matter what, right? But we also identified a list of drivers that these countries didn't have that Vietnam has, right? So these are things that are even more beneficial for Vietnam than what South Korea and Taiwan had. If we think about things, the role of women, the engagement of women in business and commerce in Vietnam is amongst the highest in the world. The mobilization rate in terms of women in the workforce is amongst the top 5 countries in the world. South Korea and Taiwan, I don't like to say it, but was built on the labor of the men because the women were either at home or doing less relevant jobs, unfortunately. Natural resources and agricultural wealth, right? South Korea and Taiwan are not rich in food, right? They struggle from an agricultural wealth point of view, and they don't have the natural resources under the ground in particular that Vietnam has or has been able to exploit. The diaspora and so on. So a whole range of things that are drivers that Vietnam has that South Korea and Taiwan do not have. So if we quickly go through them, looking at the ones that South Korea and Taiwan that had that Vietnam also has, there's a lot of them are common. And then if we, whoops, there's no tick mark there. The Vietnam ones, of course, Vietnam has as well. One that I like to talk about, I don't think we've got on the deck, right, is geography, right? The importance. I find that when you think about economic growth, or when people think about economic growth, a lot of it focuses on the numbers or the people. But actually, geography has a huge impact on economic growth. Vietnam's often compared with Indonesia, right? But let's think about that. Vietnam is one landmass, right? And everyone's connected to the water. In Indonesia, everyone's connected to the water, but they're on 15,000 islands. And those 15,000 islands contain about 650 different ethnic groups and about 400 different languages. So how does a country like Indonesia mobilize itself unilaterally to build a big economy, a modern economy? How do you build infrastructure to get to the people, to make sure that everybody has access to electricity, telecommunications, and all the other basic essentials that our societies need? Much more expensive than a country like Vietnam. So those are the sorts of things that we talk about in the book as well. And it's one that, as I said, one of the things I'm very proud about in the way that we approach this is no clear science with this. This is all anecdotal, but we do think that this type of analysis helps us understand Vietnam and can also be used to understand other countries as well in terms of their growth potential. What was this? Who else is a tiger? Okay. Is this you now? I'm passing on. All right.
I'll leave that. This is on, yeah? Okay. All right. Let's see. So who else is a tiger? A lot of countries can say, we're tigers, we're tigers. We have a fast-growing economy. We have good production. We have technology. We're tigers, we're tigers. And that's fine. But the bigger question here is this one. Can they escape the middle income trap? Because so the research for the book took 3 years, and give or take a year to a year and a half, a year to a full year of writing. And so it took a long time. But it took me 2 years, at least me personally, to realize, actually, we're writing a book, not just about Vietnam, but we're writing a book about how does a country become rich? No matter what country it is. How do you become rich? And that lends to this thing called the middle income trap. So if Vietnam's a tiger, okay, great. But can it jump? Because if a Vietnamese tiger can't jump, it's maybe a tiger, but it'll never be a rich country. It'll never be high income. And so that's where we started to look at this idea of the middle income trap. We have a whole section of it in our book. So first off, what is it? Well, it's not that old of an idea. 2 economists at the World Bank were looking at China, because China had dramatically increased the living standard of the vast majority of its people. But the question was, will they keep going? Because these economists, they learn that, some countries, they just stop. As Brooke noted, the government just goes into neutral, and there's not that many drivers to push things forward. And other countries keep growing. Why is that? Why do some people just get stuck and they don't go any further? And so that's kind of what the middle income trap's all about. So this data here is from 2018 in the World Bank, and it has the segments of low income, lower middle, upper middle, and high income. Now these numbers have probably changed a bit, but it'll illustrate my point here. So there's 216 countries in the world. So I think a lot of you are students. So where are those 216? How many countries are low income? How many lower middle? How many upper middle? How many high? So start with the bottom one. Low income. Out of 216 countries in the world, how many are low income, which is less than 1,000 GDP per capita? 50? 50? Anyone else? Low income. No Googling it. You cannot Google it. You have to either know. 35? Okay, you guys are actually more optimistic than other countries. 31. So how about lower and then upper middle? Again, 216 countries, World Bank data, 2018, GDP per capita. How many lower middle income countries are in the world, and how many upper middle in the world? First time?
Lower, I think 80 to 100.
For lower, and then for upper?
Probably 30, 35.
Okay, so then you're leaving about 30 or so for high income. Okay, so 80 plus 30, something like that. Anyone else? Just guess, yes. So 60 here, 70 here. Okay, so the break off is 4,000, yeah? Okay, 51 for lower, 53 for higher, upper. So high income, 81 countries. So yeah, it's a little bit of a wow. A lot of these countries, though, you won't recognize. But here's the problem. That thing there is real. And Vietnam is in a position of now being officially an upper middle income country, which is great because they used to be down here. And now they've moved up there. That's nice. But this is very real. It's a trap. So here's the question again. From 1960 until today, how many countries have escaped? So we just saw there's 83 countries in the high income. That's a wow. So from 1960 until this year, how many countries have joined that ranks? 25? By the way, if you get the answer right, you get a free book. So 25. If you don't answer, if you don't guess, you 15, 50, 25. You say 20. Anyone else? 40. Okay. Last chance. 70. 70 countries have escaped. Wow. I should give you a book for being optimistic. 23. So you win a book. Come on, English or Vietnamese? Okay. See, you do your homework, you get one book. And we'll sign it later. So anyway, only 23 in 60 some odd years, 65 years. And so the economists, they always have these really cool looking graphs that are hard to really understand. But this one, you can see all these countries are right here, you know? And so who are stuck? Argentina. In the 1920s, Argentina was the 20th largest economy in the world or something like that. But these days, they're a total basket case. Thailand is probably forever going to be about 7,000 or so GDP per capita. South Africa, extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources. Apartheid was over 30 years ago. They're still pretty much stuck. Indonesia, large country, 270 million people, but 15,000 islands and many languages, as Brooke noted. China, they're interesting, because China pretty much on a GDP per capita basis, nominal, is about right here. But something happened in China last year. Their population starts to go down. So they got old before they got rich. And that's not a good situation to be in. Brazil, also a big country. Malaysia, kind of sort of should be above that line. A Malaysian friend of mine who's a professor at REMIT says, no chance. We will not be high income. I said, well, why? And his answer was one word, culture. Russia was right there. Do you think for a moment they're there now, given what they've done over the last 2 years? So why are they trapped? So these are the escapees. There's 25 countries here. These 5 here we all know. And if you'll see, some of these others are very, very small countries. Slovenia, Malta, Cyprus, Croatia, Seychelles, Latvia, Estonia. Russia's here. Saudi is there. Qatar, Kuwait, UAE should be there, but they're petrostates. They're rich for one reason. Why are these guys stuck? Culture, politics, governance, education. There's lots of reasons. And these could be interesting research papers for you all. So the Asian tigers, we looked at this, we created this to say that there's a point in time of a country where they have a chance. They did something right, now they can go. Like a starting point, like a tipping point. And so the tipping point or the starting point for Hong Kong perhaps is the handover in 97. So if you start in 1950, or 55, I guess, and GDP per capita, Hong Kong looks something like this. And off they go. So they got rich before the handover. But look at this 20-year gap, 1970 to 1990. Singapore was not a country before 1965. 1965, they became a country, so that's their starting point. They didn't waste any time. They shot straight up. So again, paralleling the growth of Hong Kong, 70s, 90s, about a 20-year time frame for their rapid growth. Korea, South Korea, for me, their tipping point, their point in time was when they were awarded the Olympic Games in 1982 for the 1988 Games. But Korea was hugely poor. So when they were awarded the Games in 82, they were very much a lower middle income country. These numbers would have been a bit different, but they're definitely not high income. They're very much middle income, probably lower middle, but they took off. And the other thing that these countries can do, this reflects the 1997 economic crisis. They didn't go down and then come back up. They were able to be somewhat stable and then get through. Another sign of a tiger economy country that has multiple drivers to move forward. Taiwan, their point in time was when they were no longer China in the eyes of the US in 1980. But they started out very poor. In 1980 is when the US recognized the People's Republic of China as China, and Taiwan was something else. And to this day, that something else is still very unclear. But the Taiwanese didn't let that bother them. They just shot forward. So in both cases here, Hong Kong, Singapore, 20-year growth, South Korea, Taiwan, a 20-year growth for the four tigers of Asia. So Vietnam, starting out very, very poor. Doi Moi in 1986. The Berlin Wall came down at 89. So the socialist friends were no longer. The US embargo was finally lifted in 94. They joined the WTO in 2007. So all this happened as a low-income country. Fairly significant events that allows them to grow, in particular the WTO. And since then, this is today, 4,400 per capita. And if that trajectory is followed, that's what the Prime Minister 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, set out as a goal. General Secretary Dao Lam says this all the time, 2045, Prime Minister Xi, 2045. Will they do it? Well, that's why we are here. That's why we wrote the book. That's why hopefully you will all have good jobs in the public and private sector to make that happen. But, you know, if you choose the WTO as the starting point, 07, and add 20 years, or you choose maybe 2010 and add 20 years, you begin to imagine of how they can do what Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea were able to do. So, what can go wrong? Lots can go wrong. A whole bunch of things can go wrong. We have an entire chapter, chapter 11, that talks about what can go wrong. So the risks domestically, the distribution of wealth becomes too untenable. Corruption is never truly handled. State capacity, aging demographics. Vietnam becomes old before they become rich, like China. Japan is old, but they're rich. It's okay. Korea is old, but they're rich. Koreans don't like to have babies, apparently. Their fertility rate is like 0.7. So their population will go down, but they're already high income. Domestic international, if there's a reversal on free trade, the environment, cultural shifts, internationally, slowing growth internationally, these are all factors that we write about that said what can go wrong. You know, our final analysis of the book is fairly optimistic. And so when we're in venues like this, talking to people, saying, well, there's a chance Vietnam is a tiger and there's a chance that they can be a high income. You always get this, or at least I do. But what about, and then, but what about environment? What about corruption? But what about infrastructure? But what about rule of law? But what about governance? You can fill this screen with all the reasons that you think Vietnam has no chance. And that may, in fact, one of those may, in fact, hurt them. But maybe this thing here, FulBright 2.0, I don't know, what the party and the government are doing now with the reform, the administrative reform, it's just starting, so we don't know, but perhaps this is going to lead to something significant. Potentially, some of the things that we hope could happen, high income, more brands going abroad, Vietnamese food taking off worldwide, not just pho, bánh mì, but many things around the world. And people come here for food. There was an Oscar, the high-speed train from Hanoi to Saigon actually happens. World Cup, music, Olympic Games. In 1982, when Korea won the rights for the Olympic Games, they were about the same as Vietnam in terms of wealth. So why not? Why not Vietnam too? What's needed? Think big. Go to the World Cup. Guess what? The women already have gone to the World Cup. The men have not gone to the World Cup. So, number one, go to the World Cup. Consider trying to host the Olympic Games in the year 2048. Start working on that issue in the year 2038. Put together a proposal. Be bold enough to think like that. Oscar films. Do something significant in the renewable energy sector. And I like this one. It has to do with music. And all of you with daughters or girlfriends or nieces, you'll be very popular in your family if you are part of the team that brings her to Vietnam, Taylor Swift. Again, think big. This guy, those two, both of them are thinking big. I love this photo. And I can only imagine all the setup of making this photo happen, where Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, Prime Minister Cheng, shortly after they signed the agreement for NVIDIA to invest in 2 data centers in Vietnam, they said, hey, đi nhau nhé. Let's think about the future. AI is the future. Because obviously Taiwan and South Korea did not have the internet, much less something like AI, or a company like TSMC or a company like NVIDIA. Now we do. And Vietnam has, I think, a very good future in leapfrog technologies. So here's our analysis. It's in the book, chapter 12. By this, Vietnam would be in the upper income class, which by that time might be about here, in the year 2045. If things continue like they are. If all these issues in chapter 11 here, one of them doesn't tank the country. If things continue on a consistent basis. So that's all I got. And Harry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brooke and Sam, for a wonderful presentation. Can we please have the chair for the panel discussion?
We're going to have some coffee. We have coffee over there. We're break. Yeah. So can you begin to set up the stage?
All right, I'll say quickly a few words. Yeah. Before we wait for the chairs to be set up. My name is Harry or Hoàng Nguyễn. I'm very honored to be the moderator of the host for today's panel discussion. We are very honored that we do not just have the two authors of the book here, but we also have the Dean of the FulBright School of Public Policy and Management, Professor Jonathan Pincus, to join us today. Also, we have the faculties of the FSPPM, Professor Phạm Duy Nghĩa, from Law, Dr. Nguyễn Xuân Thành, Dr. Đại, Phạm Xuân Đại, and all the students community of FulBright. I'm told that we have about 150 people joining us online, and we take a few questions from them as well. And we have about 50, 60 people sitting here from the FulBright community and the former students of the FulBright community. And so we'll begin the panel discussion shortly. So let's have a 5-minute break. That's okay. So you'll refresh. Sorry? 3? All right. Short and sweet, please.
We book very intensively.
Mm. Okay. All right. Anh Đại ơi, cái này có turn off được không? Tại vì nó thẳng vô mắt của panelist đó. Thank you. All right. All right, everyone, we have about 30 seconds left. You have 20 seconds left, Sam. We can cite later. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Please settle down. The panel discussion. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the panel discussion on the book, Vietnam's Rising Star, by the two authors, and I'm glad to call you friends as well, Brooke Taylor and Sam Cosmo. I think this is the time and place, the exact time and place to talk about Vietnam as a rising star of the world, and also it is a wonderful place to revisit Vietnam's development model. Because 2025, as we all know, is the 50th anniversary of the ending of the Vietnam War. And the year after that, 2026, is the 40th anniversary of Doi Mai, renovation. So this is a very opportune time. Also, why this is the place is because FulBright, whose predecessor was the FETP, FulBright Economics Training Program, which has been here for 30 years, if I remember correctly, Professor Pincus, since 1993. And they've been trying to answer the exact questions that the two authors posed in the book. So I hope we have a wonderful panel discussion here today. I would like to begin by asking my first questions to all three of you, just to break the ice. So all three panelists have lived and worked in Vietnam for a very long time. You've been here since 1990. Brooke has been here 26, 27 years. Jonathan Pincus has been here since 1993 as well. So among the three of you, the total number of years lived could go up to 80 years, 80 or 90 years, right? We have 80 years of lived experience in Vietnam. How has things changed over that period of time? How has the Vietnamese economy, polity, society has changed over the years? And having lived and worked in very different fields, you know, in business, in finance, and publishing, writing, and academics and policy advisory, how has things changed? And does that long view help you understand where Vietnam will go in the next 20 or 30 years?
Okay, well, thanks, Harry, for that. And so I was first here, as I said, in 1990 as a tourist, and then a student, and then up until now. So actually living in the country close to 20 years, but the perspective of over 35 years. And so when I was first here in 1990, it was a very, very poor country and not very much optimism. A lot of people were very pessimistic. A lot of people were trying to leave through what they call the hot oil program, the ODP program. And then over time, when I left in 2004, they hadn't built the Saigon Tunnel. The metro was a dream. There was only one bridge over the Saigon River, and all these plans, and they were kind of wish list plans. And then coming back in 2018, we have a tunnel. We have 3 bridges over the Saigon River. And as of 2 weeks ago or whatever, we have a Saigon Metro. Yay! And so I guess my biggest impression, Harry, is these plans that were made 20, 25 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, came to fruition. Eventually they got done. And to me, that's the biggest takeaway, because in a lot of countries, they have plans for new airports, new rivers, new ports, bridges, and they get stuck. They don't ever quite get built. Not on budget, not on time. There's corruption, but they get done. In some countries, they don't get done. And I guess I'm encouraged by in Vietnam, I've been able to see plans and projects being completed, even if they're late. They're completed, and that's a plus for me.
Yeah, look, I won't go into the physical environment and so on. I think we can all appreciate it's changed dramatically. The skyline, when I first came, I think the tallest building was Saigon Prince Hotel or something like that, maybe in the Caravel, but it wasn't much here at all. But when I look at what's changed the most and most dramatically, I think it comes down to human capital. It's people, right? You know, the quality of student base, the quality of the people entering the workforce and building companies today is much, much higher than what we've seen in the past. I think, and that's just logical, right? You've got great academic institutions like FulBright here teaching. There's a lot of people that have also gone overseas and want to return now. And that's just upskilling the human capital in the company, in the country so significantly. And of course, it's essential, right? This is such an important driver in terms of growth. If you're not going to upskill the human capital, you're not going to get there. A couple of points I guess I've learned over the 20 plus years I've been here that relate, that timing. Firstly, when it goes back to this human capital thing, is the pace of change is often overestimated in terms of the speed at which things will change, right? And we write about this in the book. When I was here, Jonathan will remember this actually, because there was a lot of international experts that were here advising the government. And Jonathan, you might comment, but I'm sure you got very frustrated by the fact that not much of what you recommended got implemented. And it wasn't because it was wrong, it was because there wasn't buy-in, there wasn't the people listening to these experts to implement it. And there's good reason why they weren't listening. It wasn't necessarily applicable, it may not have been applicable at the time, or those individuals just didn't know or understand those changes. But now I think the speed at which change is occurring has accelerated. And in particular, I'm very, very excited about what I've seen in the last 6 or 7 years. And I think what we've seen even over the last 6 months is a very exciting step in terms of moving the country forward to where it needs to be and the acceleration of change and growth in the country. The second observation I make, which I make from an investment point of view, because again, I get back to what I do, which is advising investors in the country. People think that investing in a frontier or emerging country is risky. And I think the track record of investing in emerging and frontier countries probably justifies that risk assessment. But when you look at a country like Vietnam, one of the things I like investing in this country is that we can actually predict the future, right? One of the examples I give to investors, again, is when I came to Vietnam, there were 4 million people in Ho Chi Minh City. Today, there's somewhere between 10 and 12 million people in the city. And I know with a high degree of certainty, there will be 20 to 25 million people in the city in the next 20 to 30 years. So when you understand growth and you understand urbanization in particular, which is an important part of how countries get rich, you realize that from an investment point of view, there are many, many opportunities related to urbanization, right? And Vena Capital, that's how we invest. That's how we invest for our clients' money. If the city's going to double in size, then there's a huge demand for infrastructure. concrete companies, steel companies, schools, healthcare, all of these things benefit hugely from urbanization. And of course, real estate development companies, right? So one thing that I've learned over 20 years is the consistency in which things happen in growth if you have the right environment and the ability to be able to predict the future. So from an investment point of view, Vietnam's a very low risk environment because we can be very confident about what we're going to see going forward.
Thanks very much. I think, when you get to advanced age like myself, everywhere you go has changed a lot. So I think we need to put this into perspective. In all the countries in Southeast Asia where I've had the good fortune to work over the past 30 years or more has changed. Vietnam has certainly changed a lot, but also Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, particularly Singapore, has changed to a remarkable degree from when I first visited in 1983. So everywhere is changing. So I think we need to put Vietnam's change into that perspective. Returning to the question of what has changed the most, I think it's Vietnam's international integration is the most remarkable change from my perspective. When I first came to Vietnam, there weren't many foreign companies here. There weren't many foreign products for sale in the markets and so forth. And now Vietnam is really an integral part of these East Asian production systems, which I'm sure we'll talk about more on this panel. So for me, I think the most remarkable change over that period of 30 years has been the pace at which Vietnam has integrated into those production systems that emanate from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and now also China.
Thank you for the answers. I would like to have a follow-up question for Professor Pincus, also maybe the faculties here at FulBright and the two authors as well. So the authors make an astute observation in the book that despite being located geographically very close to Southeast Asia, Vietnamese polity, economy, and society is closer to that of the Northeast Asian countries, right? Because of its shared Confucius roots, which places importance on education, on unity, on deference to order and authority. So that's why mass mobilization is easier in Vietnam and Northeast Asia. The question of why Vietnam should follow the success of the East Asian model, Northeast Asian model, and not, I don't know how to say it, but the slightly less successful model or crony capitalism of some of these Southeast Asian countries also lies at the very heart of FulBright's research, like In the Dragon's Tail, and after that, Choosing Success. So I would like to ask all of us here, present here, what made Northeast Asia so successful, and how can Vietnam avoid falling into the middle income trap and maybe the cronyism, that the institutional bottlenecks that are tracking all of them in the middle income trap? Professor Pincus and Dr. Xuân Thanh, maybe.
Was that mark there? Okay. Yeah, this is, as I said in the introduction to this talk today, there has been a very long tradition of comparing countries of Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. At Harvard, Vietnam Studies has traditionally been in the Northeast Asia department, not in Harvard really never had a Southeast Asia department. So Harvard grouped Vietnam within the sphere of China, Japan, and Korea, for very much for those historical reasons. And there was one particular Harvard historian named Alexander Woodside who wrote a book called Vietnam and the China Model, which is a really important book, I think, for students interested in Vietnam's development to read, because basically what he said is that successive regimes in Vietnam, and now we're talking about the pre-colonial period, adopted the forms of Chinese governance a centralized an emperor with mandarins and a very hierarchical structure. But the content of these institutions in Vietnam were very Southeast Asian. And that was his main argument. So I think it's important to, there are similarities of culture. There are historical relationships that are very important. But there are also very stark differences among these countries that we group in Northeast Asia, between Japan, for example, and China. Very stark differences in culture and the way that governance is related to these, basic Confucian precepts and structures. And even more so between these Northeast Asian countries and Vietnam, because these institutions of governance look very Chinese on the surface, or at least they did traditionally. But the content is very much Southeast Asian in the sense that Southeast Asia has always had a greater degree of decentralization and flexibility of implementation than was present in Northeast Asia. So China is able, from Xi Jinping on down, to issue an edict and be pretty certain that some version of that will be implemented all the way to the grassroots. That has typically been the pattern in Southeast Asia. So you have those structures, but local governments have had more ability to resist central edicts and central direction in Southeast Asian countries. And that's largely because of the history of the formation of Southeast Asian societies, which were very much, very diverse. I mean, ethnically diverse, geographically diverse countries with uplands, lowlands. Access to water was one big differentiator. The fertility of the soil, the kinds of crops that they grew, but the tremendous diversity of Southeast Asian geography was related to this tremendous diversity of culture, which meant that the institutions could look very Northeast Asian, but the actual content was Southeast Asian. So I think, in coming back to this question about will Vietnam replicate the experience of the Northeast Asian economies? And I think, for me, the answer is no, it will not. That Vietnam's outcomes will look very different from Korea, Taiwan, and China and Japan, primarily because these are all very different countries, obviously, with their own histories, geographies, and so forth. But also because Vietnam does have many of those characteristics of Southeast Asia, in that it is a very diverse society and a very much more decentralized system of governance than we find in Northeast Asia.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
My view is that the jury is still out, right? I think if you just use the yardstick of becoming a high-income country, whether by 2045 or 2050, I think probably Vietnam will become a high-income, even if organizations like the World Bank keep raising that. But my question is, I mean, high income you can be, but whether you can become a developed country, right? So South Korea is a high income country and is a member of the OECD. Kazakhstan is a high income country, but not OECD, right? I just came back from Kazakhstan, right? And in some way, the living standards is actually below Vietnam, even though Kazakhstan is $13,000 per capita and Vietnam is 4,700, right? In Kazakhstan, they just speak Russian, right? Even in five-star hotels, right? People speak Vietnamese in Vietnam. So I do share Jonathan's, I mean, the biggest success for Vietnam is integration. If they continue the economic openness, even with rising geopolitical tension and anti-globalization in Western countries, if Vietnam keep its economy open, it still can get decent growth to become a high-income economy. But whether it can be a developed country, the reason I say the jury is still out is on whether Vietnam can continue to develop its human capital. And that's why I share Jonathan's point. This is Vietnam, looks more Southeast Asian than Northeast Asian, right? So the key features of all the successful countries that not only escape the middle income trap, but become developed country is that it increases human resources by building world-class universities that connect with both the society and industries, right? And you look at all Southeast Asia, of course, except Singapore, you don't see world-class universities. And all of these, right, high-income economies, but yet to develop. The key also common features, lack of world-class higher education institutions. And this is like a big if for Vietnam, even with the recent changes, right? At least in terms of paper or political messages, right? You can see that they put out ambitious goals in terms of education, science, and technology. Vietnam can make it, but it requires deep, more aggressive, and even brave institutional reforms, if not political, but at least institutional reforms to fix higher education.
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to sort of counter it a little bit, but also agree with what the conclusions are. We certainly said in the book, we think Vietnam's going to be a high-income nation, but I think getting over 12,000, 15,000 GDP, you're not really a rich country. That's the reality. What you're saying, a developed country, I think is a very good way of putting it. You know, to have the standards of infrastructure and living and education and everything that we aspire to is a really big challenge. And that's why, even though in our projections we said the growth rate is optimistically 7.23% in our best scenario, the reality is the country has to grow even faster than that to achieve the level it needs to achieve. And that's built on the foundations that you're referring to. A lot of this is around government capacity, capability, having the right people leading the country. One point I'd make, and I've been thinking about recently because of a book I read, and I'll refer to it in a minute. One of the reasons we look at Taiwan and South Korea, it's about the economic model, the East Asia development model. Now, people seem to take the East Asia development model very simply as it's, an export-led model where you start with garments and textiles and footwear, and you migrate up the technology until you're manufacturing smartphones and computers, which we're already doing in Vietnam. But actually, my understanding is that it's actually more around how the government defines policy to ensure that the resources within the country are used to best benefit all of the society. And I think this is a very interesting point. The book I was referring to, which I've been reading recently, is called The Road to Freedom by Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, Nobel laureate. And it made me realize that maybe the East Asian model is not, that's an important part of the jigsaw, but the most important part of seeing Vietnam get to this high income level and potentially be rich is to ensure that government policy continues to support everybody to develop society. I think that was what you were getting at, Harry. Stiglitz refers to it as neo-capitalism. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns I have when I look at either countries in Southeast Asia or developed economies around the world is that neo-capitalism is actually making rich people rich and poor people poor. Right. And it's not addressing it's not building. And I think if you get down to the roots of it, the recipe for success in the long term is to get the right government in place so that everybody in that society benefits from what's happening.
I think you have a whole chapter where things can go wrong, right? This is blocks the Vietnam's pathway. But I'm just curious, from a practical perspective, from a business side, for example, when investors come to the region and they have to consider between NVIDIA, right? When they come to the region, they have to consider between Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand. Do they really see Vietnam as distinctive from those other countries and see Vietnam as the next Korea or Taiwan? Or what are their perspectives? How would you say?
Well, for FDI, I think each company makes a decision based upon what it thinks is in its best interests. So different companies will invest in Vietnam for different reasons. A quite interesting story that we had at one of our investor conferences was Lego. They wanted to come and build a factory here. Now, interesting thing, Lego is a high-tech company, even though it makes toys, and it didn't come to Vietnam for low labor cost. It came to Vietnam because of Vietnam's commitment to COP26, right? That was a key decision around, the board was in Denmark making a decision whether we're going to Vietnam or one of the other countries in Southeast Asia. And literally that came out. Now, whether that's a different issue, whether they can get COP26 commitments to zero carbon neutral by 2050. But actually, I heard the rep from Lego say, that was key. And the comment on the board was that government's thinking like we're thinking, not short term, but long term about the future. And we have the same values. So that's just Lego's story. NVIDIA's one, well, they're making the decisions of a range of different factors. One of the interesting things with NVIDIA, of course, is what they sell, the chips, are actually restricted in terms of which countries they can be sold to. And I think that's a geopolitical issue, right? That Vietnam is in this bamboo diplomacy and relationship that it has. It enables to straddle its relationship with China and the United States. It might be one of those countries that has access to those chips. There are a lot of countries that will not have access to those chips. And so every company looks at Vietnam in a different way. The nice thing is more companies see something they like in Vietnam than something they prefer in some other countries.
I think this leads very nicely to my last question for the panel discussion. The new leadership in ANO, which we've mentioned a few times, is very determined to bring Vietnam into what they call the new era, right? With goals of becoming a higher middle income country by 2030 and a high income developed country by 2045. They talk a lot about leading in AI and semiconductor, and attracting foreign investment in those areas, biotechnology, so on and so forth. I think just 2 days ago, there was a national conference convened by Mr. Tolam himself on science and technology, and that was the very first time it was live streamed on VTV1, right? And how to leapfrog science and technology into the 21st century. However, we've talked about how it will be difficult because Professor Robert Wade of the LSE made the observation that over the past 2 centuries, there have been fewer than 10 non-Western countries that have grown from low income to high income. So over the past 200 years, right, there have been only a handful of non-Western countries. And Northeast Asia took up about 5 or 6 already, right? So also the current global environment is also very different from when Korea or Taiwan were, when they were growing at double digits. So the Prime Minister is very determined that Vietnam should grow at double digits over the next 20 years to reach the 2045 goal. Do you think that is realistic, given the fact that most of we have signed about more than 15 FTAs, if I remember correctly, 17 of them already, and protectionist policies by advanced countries like the US and the EU, so on and so forth, made traditional trade and industrial policy almost impossible nowadays. So what can we do to leapfrog past the lower middle income to higher middle income and high income? That's go past the middle income trap. What can the Vietnamese government do in terms of policy, and the business community can do to advocate to help Vietnam grow at such a fast level? And also, does quantity equate with quality? We've talked about high income is could be achievable, but whether Vietnam can become developed is a different concept. The ability to produce, to manufacture, to own the technology, to integrate into the global supply chain, and not just assemble for other countries. For other firms.
Well, that's a really hard question to answer succinctly. I guess I just have a couple ideas or points on that. Number one is, on one of our slides here, we had the old Cold War, the new Cold War. Old Cold War, the USA, USSR. Taiwan and South Korea chose a side. They were on the American side, and if you took away that relationship, the ability of those two countries to have grown as fast as they did would have been different if they were, had chosen the other side or remained neutral or so on. We have a new Cold War, China and the US. And Vietnam, of course, is being asked to choose, and they have the bamboo diplomacy idea, which I think is a good one personally. And so I guess, how do you leapfrog the middle income trap? You don't. You go through it. You work extraordinarily hard every day for a long time. You remain hungry. All of your parents, and especially your grandparents, were hungry, and they kept going. A key generational shift is whether your son or daughter, your son will be hungry or not. Because Koreans were hungry for 3-4 generations, and that's why they made it. And they very effectively played the politics of the Cold War at the time. So you don't leap over the middle income trap. You go through it. And I think you work hard. There's no mystery here. You work extraordinarily hard, and you read chapter 11 of our book. You buy 2 copies each and read chapter 11 twice. Because in chapter 11, we talk about what can go wrong. And so a student asked me once, what are you most worried about? And I said, I'm most worried about wealth disparity. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and they just don't have a chance. That's the case in South Africa. That's the case, I would argue, in the Philippines and even Thailand. And so there's a whole combination of things for this to go forward. But I think NVIDIA announcing their decision to choose Vietnam for at least two pieces of their strategy is a good sign. They obviously see something here, like Lego saw something here that fits their worldview. And now it's up to you to remain as hungry as your parents, your grandparents were. Because it's not going to be given to you. You don't leapfrog anything. You have to go through it yourselves. It's my 2 cents.
I'll give my 2 cents.
Yeah.
I haven't done the numbers, and I don't understand the numbers well enough to know whether we can get to 10% growth rates. It seems very ambitious. It won't happen within a couple of years, and it will take a lot of things going right. And it's not within, all of it's not within Vietnam's control. But you have to set very ambitious goals. I mean, I do feel one of the things that Taiwan and South Korea did is they mobilized people in a very coordinated way, right? And Vietnam can do that. We wrote about in the book about how Vietnam responded to COVID. But I think that we do need to set some lofty goals. And if the stars do align, then, we can get there. I'm a very optimistic person. But, looking at it from the numbers point of view, that's beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, I would say a big difference between China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Vietnam is that Vietnam does not have Vietnamese companies in the Fortune 500. So if you look at Taiwan, they have, TSMC, they have ASUS, they have a range of different manufacturing enterprises that are in the Fortune 500. China now does. Japan obviously does. Korea obviously does. Vietnam is basically an assembly operation at the moment in terms of manufacturing. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and those are encouraging. But Vietnam's exports are the most import intensive in the region. So for Vietnam, in terms of value added, according to the OECD figures, 55% of Vietnam's export values is imported. So that means what Vietnam is basically doing is taking inputs, semi-manufactured goods from the rest of East Asia and assembling them with relatively low-cost labor and re-exporting them. That is not a model for a high-income country. And in order to increase the amount of domestic value added, we need strong Vietnamese companies that are not just assembling, but they are also designing. And they are at the apex of the industrial structure. So they become the system integrators. Now, China very consciously set out to do this 30 years ago. So they were not content to be an assembler of other people's products. They wanted to have their own apex corporations that were branded and that were that had the technological capability to drive innovation domestically. And that's the gap. That's essentially the gap. So we can, shoot lines off into space and say what Vietnam's income is going to be in 30 years, but that's pretty much a meaningless exercise. What's important is to what extent Vietnam is capable of innovating and capturing more domestic value added. So I agree with Xuan Tang when he says that, the big gap is knowledge, technology, higher education, research, investment in research and development, which is still quite low in Vietnam and needs to be increased. And that's an important policy lesson, I think. Related to that, I think another lesson from the Northeast Asian economies is that they were very successful in bringing home their diaspora. So Taiwan, Japan, Korea, China had a large scientific diaspora in the US, in Europe, and other places. Very highly trained people, PhDs in engineering and physics and all these other advanced sciences, working in major multinational corporations, and they attracted them back. And it was a very conscious effort to do that. It's not happening in Vietnam. It's not happening for various reasons, some of which has to do to the governance of the higher education sector. So they don't want to come back to Vietnamese universities for obvious reasons, pay, working conditions, what have you. And they're also not coming back in large numbers to Vietnamese corporations. Why? Because most of these corporations are foreign corporations. They're not Vietnamese corporations. So I think that's the challenge, how to create domestic companies and universities, research centers that will attract that scientific diaspora, Vietnam scientific diaspora back home. And it is, it is a huge, now in 2025, it is a huge diaspora. There are literally thousands of very highly skilled advanced scientists working in a wide range of institutions who are Vietnamese. And I think that many of them would welcome the opportunity to come back, but not enough effort has gone into creating an environment that will attract them back. So if I were to say one thing that would determine whether Vietnam makes it to this high income status and beyond high income to an actual highly developed economy is, can Vietnam create those institutions, those corporations, those domestic corporations that will attract this very highly skilled scientific diaspora back to Vietnam?
Well, just a couple comments. One is what Dean Pincus said, I'll bet word for word was said in 1985 in Taipei City in Seoul, South Korea. We need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. And so countries and companies have to start somewhere. So I appreciate that you said about the diaspora coming back, because I was living in Taiwan when the Taiwanese government made their appeal to the overseas Chinese community, which is give or take 40 million people, 5 million for the Viet Kieu diaspora. And they made a very formalized appeal to the overseas Chinese community in 1985, 86 or something like that. And I was writing a piece about that. I interviewed a microbiologist who had a full career in the United States and got pulled back, came back, agreed to come back. Another guy also came back. His name was Morris Cheng, and he set up TSMC. So TSMC started in 1987, and they started it because of this appeal to the overseas Chinese community to come back. And so, you know, it's a rhetorical question. Do you think Koreans and Taiwanese were having this same discussion about their inability, their companies are too small, we don't have a global brand? Perhaps. I'm not sure. Well, right. Okay. So my point being is that this discussion has happened before, and Taiwan and South Korea are models of how do you get proactive on that. And I think the government program to bring back the diaspora was a huge part of that. And Vietnam should do that, and I hope they are doing that.
Thank you for the lively discussion. So now we open up the floor to Q&A. Please raise your hand. We'll prioritize people who stay here with us from the very beginning. Also, I'm told that we have about 200 participants online and offline. So maybe we take a few questions from both audience here and also joining us online. Please raise your hand. Okay.
Excuse me. Okay. My name is Ngang Sophie. Call me Sophie. Thank you very much. It's just short time. So regarding to your discussion is so impressive, but I know that your book is so popular today, and I also know that the youth are also very favorite, and I've read this newspaper, but still the term that you are raising now is I just read the book, but I don't understand why the high income becomes the focus of your book and your presentation today. So that's because as Dr. Neil has said, I really impressed because the way that you analyze this, you analyze a lot of factors now, especially, but the focus on economics is so large. And when you put Vietnam into, the present situation, we face with not just, economists. In the case of Bhutan, for example, they have declared to become high income country in 29, but even that their rank is really high in our world because the high income is not the standard of everything. So I just would like to ask you, how about your viewpoint of developed country? The first thing. The second thing is as a Dr. Vickers has discussed about the risks of when compare Vietnam with other countries, and also you talk about the law of law in education and other like technology, and it could make a big risk. So how in your books, I have read that you also present VinFast on other case of successful story of Vietnam, and how do you think about the risk of that? How do you focus on you give more insight about that? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great long question. So you want to take a few questions at a time, or you want to answer? Okay, let's do two more questions. We take three at the same time. You want to answer that? Okay.
What were we saying? I forgot what the first question was, but look, that was just really a benchmark to give some perspective, I think. When you're asking that question, I guess what you were referring to is there are many things that are important in our societies beyond simply being rich. And I think, what we do, though, is say, well, in general, rich countries satisfy a lot of the needs of our societies more effectively than poor countries. But what we do write about in the book, and I think we are proud about, is some of the other changes that people can expect to see as the country moves forward. So one thing that we identify is that global culture is defined by rich countries, right? So the foods we eat, the movies we watch, the music we listen to really comes from rich countries, right? Poor countries really struggle. And one of the things that we expect will change as in the years ahead is that the world will, as Vietnam's growth and internationalization continues to increase, that internationally Vietnam will be more recognized. Its culture, its identity will be, you know, one of the questions when we first published the book was, do you think that Vietnamese culture is dying? K-pop and American movies and all these sorts of things. We said, well, it's going through a period of change, but as it gets more wealthy, it will get stronger. We expect there will be V-pop one day, right? We expect that there could be a Vietnamese movie that wins an Academy Award, because these are the things that happen as countries grow and move forward. So, and I think the well-being of the people improves as a result of it, and the people become more proud. I think brand Vietnam is going to become more and more well-known. It's known well at the moment, but it will become more famous, particularly if it becomes a G20 country. What was the second one? VinFast. We were very cautious about how we wrote about VinFast, and we used it in respect to a specific case that we felt, look what can be done if there's real focus in the country. And they built a factory from nothing within 2 years and launched a car. You know, Sam interviewed the CEO, I interviewed the CEO as well. And he was saying, you know, what I've achieved here in 2 years, it takes Chrysler 9 years, right? And it really impressed us, the ability to be able to build and execute and build cars. I think they've been very ambitious trying to build a global car company, and they might realize that now. But on the face of it, the construction of that factory, launching those cars, is an amazing achievement and shows what can be achieved here if the right focus and attention is given to it.
Okay, next question, please.
My question is, what's not important factor have Vietnam economy grow fast right now? What the tipping point?
So maybe we take one more from the online audience as well, if we have it. Do we have? No? We have? Okay, one more from the live audience here then.
Sure. First, thanks the author for the information today. I think my question is more directed towards Mr. Sam Cosmo, right? Because you mentioned a very interesting point about, I mean, South Korea or Taiwan probably would not have grown so fast if they have not been supported by, I mean, the global superpower at the time, the US, right? Of course, all the other factors about, I mean, the hardworking people, the culture, probably the country would have still grown, but at a much lower, I mean, probably like lower space than that they have grown. So in the case of Vietnam, right? I mean, given that, I mean, Vietnam still pursuing this, I mean, bamboo diplomacy thing. I mean, how does the country still, I mean, I would say harness the support of global superpowers, that they don't see Vietnam as a potential, I mean, thorn in the eye, but instead of something they want to support, right? I mean, and then the tango is maybe even more difficult with, I mean, the complexities right now that even allies sometimes, I mean, you know, I mean, are against each other, right? So like, what's your thinking?
I guess my thinking is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs some extremely bright people, and they have extremely bright people to manage this. There geographically, obviously, Vietnam is right next to China, and They have more trade with the U.S. than with, I'm sorry, with China than with the U.S., but both are, I think, top 5 trading partners of Vietnam. And I guess I don't have an answer to this other than Taiwan and South Korea had to choose, and they chose. This is a new era, a new time. Everything is new. And Vietnam is choosing bamboo diplomacy, and so far they have been extraordinarily good at it, I think. And I really appreciate that because that's crucial. I stand by my comment that Taiwan and South Korea would not have succeeded as they had if not for U.S. support. And Vietnam is moving forward with support from the world, if you will, not choosing one country, not choosing one side. And that's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of diplomacy. It's going to take people like this guy, you know, being at the table and talking and engaging.
Yeah, I think Jonathan's comments around human capital, transfer of technology, research, that absolutely agree with. But that's really the medium to longer term one. It can't make immediate change. If we think about the next 5 years, within the next 5 years, firstly, the government has announced infrastructure projects. We need to see those move forward, be executed to stimulate the economy. We need international markets to remain open and accessible so that we can continue to export. And the one that's perhaps not talked about enough, which is really, really important, is we have to create that middle class. We have to increase consumption domestically. If you look at the statistics, Vietnam is extremely, so much of GDP is driven by imports and exports, right? And that's not sustainable in the long term, particularly if you're making low value products, right? So what we have to see is we have to see the economy expand domestically, and that comes about through developing the middle class.
We don't have much time left, so I would like to end this panel discussion and Q&A with an anecdote. My own professor, Ha Jun Chang, made an observation that when he was growing up in South Korea in the 1970s and 1980s, Hyundai, the car manufacturer, exported its first 10 cars to the US. And back then, everyone in the US laughed at them. Who is Hyundai? I mean, we have GM, we have Ford, right? Toyota was still very small, right? Back then, Samsung was still a processor of salmon, if I remember correctly. Look at where they are now, right? Samsung, Hyundai, Lotte, all of them became big chaebol. So maybe we can trim big as well, as you said in the book. And Vietnam is also not just dream big, but actively talk about how we achieve it. That's already progress than in the past. We just set goals. We don't talk about how we achieve it. So maybe we can set very lofty goals and try to achieve it at the same time and see how things go. Just keep going, right? Okay, thank you very much, all the panelists, for the lively discussion. Thank you, everyone. And we have wonderful books here if you want to purchase and buy. The authors would lovely stay back a little bit more to sign all of them. Thank you, Professor Pincus and FulBright, for co-hosting and organizing. Thank you very much, everyone. If everyone want to have pictures with us?
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just have a list of the German ones. Please before the book.